I'd like to welcome you all today to the Constitution Day event. My name is Kevin Johnson. I'm the director of the Center for First Amendment Studies here at California State University, Long Beach. I'd like to welcome you to this year's event. I'd like to thank the Provost Brian Jersky for hosting this event, the Dean David Wallace for his support, to the faculty for offering extra credit and so forth to have students attend today's event. I'd like to thank you for being in attendance and thank the professors for coming along and thinking with us about the Constitution. What we'd like to do today is to share with you a little bit of a background about the Constitution, how it works, how it functions, what the purpose of a Constitution Day event is, and then be able to share with you maybe some recent issues and controversies. The Constitution Day is a congressional mandate passed by the federal government, making it to where any university that receives federal funds in the United States has to have a Constitution Day observance every year on September 17th, with the provision that if September 17th falls on a weekend, it can be held any day of the week before or after. So hence we are here to celebrate and observe Constitution Day on our campus. In the past, we've done quite a few things with Constitution Day. The Center for First Amendment Studies has hosted Constitution Day every single year, and we've tackled some very controversial issues, and we've talked about some of the events that have developed in terms of our First Amendment. We have talked about government strategies for silencing the opposition. We've talked about a profile of the Supreme Court and how they go about interpreting their First Amendment cases. We focused on the influence of big money in political elections in the wake of Citizens United. We focused on same-sex marriage as both an equal protection right and a freedom of expression right in the Constitution. We've had a panel discussion on issues concerning the First Amendment and last year's elections, which was really insightful to trace the candidates and the media coverage in those cycles. This year we'll focus on some current events regarding the First Amendment, both in the press and in college campuses that happen throughout the United States. So what I'd like to do today is to share with you at the beginning and at the outset a little bit of the basics, a little overview of the First Amendment to make sure that we all know what it is, to make sure that we are talking about maybe some of the facts and some of the statistics that we have about the larger culture of the First Amendment, and then we'll talk about some of the details about how that interpretation process works when it comes to the First Amendment. After I do that in the introduction here, we'll then turn it over to our speakers today, who I'll introduce before they speak, and they will talk about some current issues concerning the First Amendment in their various capacities. So I'd like to begin with a general First Amendment overview. How many of you know what the First Amendment says? Is there anybody in here who knows the First Amendment verbatim by heart? Who can stand up and recite it like you did in the Pledge of Allegiance, probably in your elementary school classrooms? Probably not many, so let me read each word for you. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The way that I remember this is that I hold out my hand, and on my hand there's four fingers and a thumb, right? So I remember the First Amendment freedoms by holding out my hand. You have freedom of speech, press, religion, petition, and assembly. They're all on one hand. So if you ever want to remember how many freedoms at least there are in the First Amendment, you can always remember it by your hand if you have four fingers and a thumb, okay? So that is the way that I remember what the First Amendment is. Not all Americans can name what the First Amendment is all about. For example, here's some statistics, some data that the Center for First Amendment Studies has been able to collect. 39% of Americans cannot name any of the freedoms in the First Amendment, 39%. Of those that know at least one of the freedoms of the First Amendment. 54% know of the freedom of speech, 17% religion, 12% assembly, 11% press, and 2% petition. Okay? So our First Amendment knowledge in the United States doesn't appear to exist at a very high level. Let me ask you, if you haven't had a class with me before, or you're not a professor at the university, can any of you name all 9 active Supreme Court justices?
I can name one.
You can name one. Which one can you name? Okay, so we've got Ruth Bader Ginsburg, RBG. Most people affectionately call her the notorious RBG, right? I think RBG is its own acronym in and of itself, meaning revolutionary but gangsta, but that's a different story. Another one. Did you have another one? Okay. Gorsuch and Kennedy, right? These are 2 other Supreme Court justices. Anybody else can name, we've got Justice Gorsuch, we've got Justice Kennedy, Justice Ginsburg.
Roberts, Alito.
Okay, so we have Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito, yes? Justice Thomas, right? And Elena Kagan, right? Justice Kagan. And Justice Sotomayor, correct, all right? And apparently Justice Breyer gets no love today. This is not surprising. 2/3 of the American public cannot name a single Supreme Court justice in the United States Supreme Court. So we did pretty well today, all right? 2/3 of the American public cannot name a single Supreme Court justice. Only 1% of Americans can name all 9, okay? That means that in our 3 branches of government, we have almost everyone, I would say, in the United States knows who our president is. Or if you prefer to say not my president, I've heard that go around too, right? So most of us can name the president of the United States. Many people might know a senator or 2. Some people may know a representative. So many of us are really engaged with the people who make our laws and the people who sign those laws into existence, the people with executive and legislative authority, but almost no one can name all 9 Supreme Court justices who have the power to overrule both of those branches of government as a form of checks and balances. So even though the Supreme Court has this tremendous ability to overrule these 2 branches of government, 99% of the public doesn't even know who they are, right? And so what I'm here today to be able to discuss is not only the Supreme Court justices, but what is this mysterious document at times that we call the Constitution? As a rhetorically trained scholar, I study this fancy thing called hermeneutics, okay? Hermeneutics roughly means the relationship between the way that we interpret things, the meaning that we invest in those things, the beliefs that people have, and how we're invested in particular notions of truth that we believe to be true, all right? This is exactly what is happening when we look at the Constitution. It's an interpretive exercise. We have these words that are found in the Constitution, in the First Amendment. And what we do is we interpret them based on cases that confront us. They're general overarching values, general overarching guidelines. And those get interpreted in particular ways based on the cases that we have. So our speakers today may talk about particular instances, how these things are negotiated on college campuses, how we negotiate this constitutional text. And this is no easy exercise. People disagree with how we even interpret the text. Even if they reach the same conclusions, they could agree on the same paradigms by which we interpret the Constitution. Most people believe, for example, that the former Justice Scalia and Justice Thomas were aligned all the time because they had similar judicial philosophies. But then how do you go about explaining when they disagree? How do you go about explaining cases like Brown versus Entertainment Merchants Association when Justice Scalia believes that violent video games are protected and Justice Thomas says that they're not, right? That requires a more nuanced understanding. As students of rhetoric, as scholars of rhetoric, we can make these differentiations. We make them through the study of what we would call this fancy term, hermeneutics. So let me offer you a useful guideline to be able to understand this complicated matrix of constitutional interpretation. Rooted in Philip Bobbitt's famous work on constitutional interpretation, he identifies 6 modalities, is what they're called, of constitutional interpretation. These modalities help shape and form the opinions that are made regarding the Constitution's application in particular cases that come before a court, that come before a population, that make us determine how this First Amendment ought to apply. The first of which is a historical interpretation. Individuals that use a historical interpretation of the Constitution would say, how do we interpret what this means based on what it meant when it was agreed to in the first place, right? So people who are interested in the question of the First Amendment from a historical interpretation would say, what did the First Amendment mean at the time that the framers were attempting to ratify it, when it was passed into law? Not what we think about it today, but what did it mean at the time that it was agreed, signed into law, contracted, literally, okay? And that's not an easy proposition, right? The framers disagreed immensely on what the First Amendment meant. So there's many ways that one would have this historical argument, but that's going to be very different than, for example, the second modality, which is a textual modality, right? The textual modality of the First Amendment takes a look at it in terms of the plain words in the First Amendment. What do the words mean? So when the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law, when a university says students shouldn't have any free speech rights, a textualist might say, the First Amendment says nothing about universities making these rules. It says Congress shall make no law. It doesn't say that universities shall make no law, right? Congress, if you look up the definition of the word Congress, it doesn't mean universities. So universities can do whatever they want. And you can see how that might be different than the way that a historical interpreter of the text might take it, right? Similarly, this impacts the way that we look at the words, right? Do you have the right to communicate on the internet? Most people today would probably believe that the First Amendment protects you in your speech, for the most part, on the internet. A textualist might disagree. If they would say, look up the word speech in a dictionary. If you look up the word speech in the dictionary, it does not mean internet. We think of speech as an act of speaking in public, words, right? Delivery, these things that are bound up in the way that we think about speech. You wouldn't say, I gave a speech today, and have that meant by an audience to mean that you made a Facebook post, right? That's different from what that word means. So a textualist might say, wow, your case is coming before and you're claiming that the First Amendment protects your right to internet speech. No, this isn't speech at all. Get out of my courtroom, right? Speech is oral delivery, right? So a textualist might disagree with some of these this content thing, whereas a historical interpreter might say, yeah, but historically, we see that there's a value inherent in the democratic enterprise. And that means that speech is more about communication, right? And not just oral communication, as is what is in speech, but the ability for us to make decisions and deliberate and have this information flow. And so that value means that it has to extend to the internet today, right? So historically, might disagree with the textualist approach, right? The third modality has to do with precedent, right? The doctrinal modality is what it's called. And the doctrinal modality is rooted in this legal concept of stare decisis, roughly translated, let the decision stand. The rationale behind stare decisis is that if we make our decisions based on previous rulings that the court has handed down, then we'll have a better idea of how to conduct our affairs in the future. If we don't abide by previous mandates of cases and how we've interpreted them, then we never would know how to conduct our operations within the rule of law. There would be almost no predictability. We would never know if our political speech was protected, if it's protected in one case and then overruled in the next case, and then protected in the next case and overruled in the next case. People in the United States would say, I have no idea what's protected anymore, right? And so the rationale behind stare decisis is that we look to previous decisions and we let them stand as a factor of interpreting our current policies. The next modality is a prudential modality. The prudential modality, quite simply, is about the workability of a decision. So for example, a judge might take a look at a case before them and say, you know what? The precedent that I would set by ruling for one side in favor of one side and not the other would be so hard to litigate all the cases that would come before it in the future, right? If I rule in favor of this side and not this side, then I'm going to have 50,000 cases filed in the lower courts immediately overnight. There's no way the lower courts can handle that kind of caseload. We don't have enough rooms to be able to do this, right? And so as a result, a judge might balance that pragmatic, that prudential kind of modality with their decision and say, we'll rule this way in this particular case and set the precedent going forward, but maybe it's not retroactive, right? It doesn't apply to the past because it just won't work, right? We don't have the ability to handle that in our infrastructure, right? So this prudential modality kind of persists. Yeah?
Is this opposite from the doctrinal?
Yeah, the doctrinal looks at the previous cases, remember? So it takes a look at the previous cases to be able to figure out, since we know this body of cases has come before us, what does that mean when we're looking at the current case, right? Does it work, right? What is the impact? So even though it might be in line with these cases, right, and I should probably rule in this way, the prudential modality would say, maybe I need to carve out an exception to these precedents, or maybe I need to alter my decision in some way because the kind of system that we have just can't handle all of that litigation, all of that pragmatic kind of stuff, right? It could, but I don't want you to confuse that with the ethical modality, right? And that's the danger that I'm going to get to in just a second. But the prudential is about the workability, the logistics, right? The implementation of it, right? That's not a question of good or bad. It's just a question of feasibility, right? Can you do this, right? Just like, so a prudential consideration in this classroom would be, can we admit 500 students to this classroom? No, we can't. Fire codes, we can't fit that many students in this room, right? That's a pragmatic concern. That's not an ethical concern, right? Because ethically, we might be committed to allowing those 500 students access to an education, right? But pragmatic feasibility, we might make a different kind of conclusion, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So then the fifth one is a structural modality. And this requires people to balance competing interests that are built within the Constitution, right? Sometimes our amendments conflict with each other. For example, you have the right to vote and you have the right to assemble, right? Do you have the right to assemble in a way that blocks people's access to voting booths? But wait a minute, you have the right to assemble, right? So there's got to be a way to figure out when you're going to privilege one right and another right when they're in conflict. These rights sometimes come into conflict. So the structural modality requires this kind of balancing act, right? So you do have the right to peaceably assemble, and then we create these barriers of 500-foot restrictions from polling places and all of these other things that we have to protect the right to vote and the right to peaceably assemble, right? It's a negotiation of these rights built into the structure of this contradiction, okay? And then the last modality is the ethical modality. And the ethical modality is the one where we interpret the Constitution with the idea that it needs to work for us, right? This is the one that many conservative judges and jurists and many liberal judges and jurists, I don't like those terms of conservative and liberal justices. I think that the hermeneutics gets at it better in the fine distinctions. But this is the one that is the source of a lot of disagreement, right? One says we need to be bound to the values of the past, as rooted in the time of the passage of the First Amendment. The other one says we're the ones who have to live with this, right? We're the ones who have to interpret it in order to work for us, right? When the Constitution was ratified, rights didn't include women. Rights didn't include slaves. Rights didn't include a whole host of people that it proclaimed to be able to be under the banner of we the people. So maybe that means that we the people today, from an ethical perspective, needs to be redefined so that it can work for us, right? And the whole philosophy behind the ethical modality is to say that America is in a constant state of maturity, right? If you take a look at the document as the birth of a document, the origins of how we're going to run civil society, the ethical modality says we have the right to be teenagers. We have the right to be adults. We have the right to mature as a democracy as we learn the lessons from each other going forward, right? That means we might need to reinterpret the we and we the people. That means that we might need to reinterpret our provisions so that we are closer to inclusion, or as our university likes to say, inclusive excellence, right? And so we have these values that are built in to this framework.
So in the beginning you said that there's a lot of people that don't know about the Constitution, and the First Amendment said you have the freedom of religion, speech, press, petition, and assembly. Do you think it's because the people don't know, or because of their interpreting it in the wrong way?
So as a rhetorical scholar, I will never be able to conclude that people are interpreting it in a right or wrong way. You know, as an individual, I think that I have a sense of moral ethics between right and wrong. But as a rhetorical scholar, people interpret it different ways. You can reach liberal conclusions from a historical perspective if you think that there are values that are inherent in the origins of the document, right? This is what happened with Justice Stevens, right? Many people believe that he had a liberal interpretation of Citizens United, right? What he did in Citizens United is he had said, let's look at what the First Amendment meant at the time of the Constitution's ratification, right? At the time, Congress issued charters to corporations, and corporations were meant to answer to Congress. So Justice Stevens argued that corporations never had the right originally to influence elections. The electors were their bosses, right? They don't get an influence to say who their bosses are. They don't get to choose the congressional entities and back certain congressional entities that are in their interests. Congress determines those interests, and corporations answer to them. So he wrote in to that particular decision what might be concluded as a liberal value based on a historical interpretation of the text that differed in terms of the result of the case, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So today what I'd like to do is hand it over to our speakers today. This is an overarching framework. They're going to allude to particular cases in their experience in the First Amendment. So I'd like to first introduce Professor Jennifer Asinas. She earned her PhD from the University of Texas. She's published work in the Supreme Court, or in the Center's First Amendment Profile of the Supreme Court, and in notable academic outlets, including First Amendment Studies Journal, Communication Law Review, and Rhetoric Society Quarterly. She currently serves as chair of the Freedom of Expression and Political Communication Division of the Western States Communication Association. She served as a graduate research fellow of the Center from 2000 to 2002, and her work with the Center involves thinking about the intersection between rhetoric and the First Amendment issues, including the role of metaphor, such as the marketplace of ideas, rhetorical style and audience adaptation in the legal context, with judicial style and constitutional hermeneutics, and the narratives surrounding the First Amendment. In addition, she's participated in international forums in Italy and most recently in Canada, where she's been able to discuss freedom of expression in different cultural contexts. So I'd like to welcome Professor Asinas.
You all hear me all, you're blessed to hear me all the time, so I'm going to be brief so that we can move on to our other speakers. All right, so college. We still have purple college. So college. So there's college, like what your parents think you're doing, which is running around in togas and partying, right? There's what society thinks you're doing, and they're doing underwater basket weaving. When I applied to college, what I thought I was doing, right? So when in doubt, go to the library. Maybe I thought there was a little bit of that too. But also what's been happening on a lot of college campuses is this kind of stuff, right? So whether it's at Berkeley, or it's at UC Davis, or if it's at Yale, there's been a lot of social upheaval. There's been a significant uptick in protests on college campuses across the United States that have resulted in property damage, violence, firings, students who have been suspended from schools and then let back in again too. Right? So there's been all kinds of things that have been happening on these campuses, and all of them are very intricately tied to this notion of the First Amendment, right? What do you get to express on campus? When do you get to express it? And sometimes it's hard to know, because it might be shocking to you all to find out that some people don't think that South Park is funny. Who knew, right? So what I'd like to talk a little bit about today is education and expression. So there's lots of justifications for the First Amendment and why we might think that the First Amendment is important to us as a nation, to the health of our democracy. And so I'd like to tease through and think through some of these things. And think through it from what we do and what I do in a class on rhetoric, is to think through it from a rhetorical perspective. So what I'd like to talk a little bit about are a few of the current cases in campus expression, some basic assumptions about the connection between education and expression, and then a little bit of a rhetorical perspective. We're going to talk about ethos because we talked about it last time in class. Turns out that was Tuesday, since I can't remember what day it is. So we're going to talk about it in terms of credibility. So, some background cases. So earlier this year, in February, right, in Cal, whether you like the Bears or not, so Milo Yiannopoulos was invited to come to campus there, right, on one of his tours to talk about his books. So if you know about Milo, he says some very interesting things. So he was the editor of Breitbart News. He's known for his gleeful attacks on political correctness, which he thinks is terrible, and sometimes veers into things that are offensive, racially and otherwise. I think most recently he was called on the carpet because he made a post about his house in Miami, that the roof had blown off. Did you see this? That the roof had blown off, and so people were like, oh my gosh, Milo, that's so terrible. And then Newsweek put him on blast and said, actually, that's not Milo's house. So anyway, he was like, oh, it's a joke. So anyway, So Milo does lots of interesting things. He calls feminism a cancer, right? He held up a sign that said that, "Dear Trump, please deport fat people." So he says lots of interesting things, right? So before he came to Cal, he had just been in Washington, and actually there are protesters there as well who said we don't want him on at this campus, and someone was shot in the process. So that's a little bit of background about Milo and what he was doing. So in response, folks in Berkeley, there's a varying response. Folks in Berkeley descended on Sproul Hall, which is also the location where the birth of the free speech movement, especially on campuses, came out of. But there are all these signs and all these protesters there, right? So out of Berkeley, Nazi scum people held up. And then also there was property damage and there was violence, so the event got canceled, right? And so Milo's response to this, right, afterwards, is that the left, right, that the left is terrified. They're absolutely terrified of free speech, right? Don't want free speech on campus. Another event, back in 2015, involved Yale. So in 2015, Swastikas sent out an email in response to a request that students not dress in offensive costumes for Halloween, right? So an organization on Yale's campus put out a notice to students that said, if you could not dress in these kinds of things because people find it really offensive, right? So please don't show up in blackface. Please don't dress like a Native American. Please don't dress like, so all of these kinds of things that we hear that go around on campus. Swastikas, which is actually Nicholas's wife, wrote a response to that. And in that response email, she says, "It seems to me that we can have this discussion of costumes on many levels. We can talk about complex issues of identity, free speech, cultural appropriation, and virtue of signaling." But then she goes on to say, "But I want to share my thoughts with you from a totally different angle as an educator concerned with the developmental stages of childhood and young adulthood." So she continues on and says, "Even if we could agree on how to avoid offense, and I'll note that no one around campus seems overly concerned about the offense taken by religiously conservative folks to skin-revealing costumes, I wonder why why she's not trying to go on and say that other costumes of offense shouldn't be worn." So essentially she's saying that if you find offense to it, it should be up to you, right, as an individual, to say to that person, you shouldn't be wearing that. Right? She says that college campuses used to be spaces of freedom and expression, and how come they can't be that anymore? Well, some students got mad, right? And they said, "I can't believe that you're being so insensitive. Look at the kind of place that you're creating." And then if you've seen it on YouTube, they confronted her husband, who also worked at Yale. They confronted her husband, and they sort of had a little showdown there. And then there were also protests in response to that. So this idea that campuses should be safe spaces for people, right? That they shouldn't have to, that they should feel safe on campus, and that it's our responsibility to create those kinds of safe places. All right, so next one, a little closer to home, Orange Coast College. Okay, so all you OCC grads out there, woo. So Orange Coast College. So right after the election of Donald Trump, in 2000, when they came back to classes, Olga Perez-Sable-Cox said, "We have been assaulted," right? That Trump's election was an act of terrorism. So there was a student in the class who voted, I'm assuming he voted for Trump, but identified as conservative, although he wanted to keep his identity under wraps so as not to find the repercussions from that. So anyway, so he posted this video because he didn't feel like the administration was doing enough. And of course, then there was outrage on both sides, right? Some folks came out and said, you should be careful what you say, right? This is supposed to be education, not indoctrination. I wish I had that kind of power over you. Like, I would just say it, and you would all just believe. Right? But education, not indoctrination. So there are protests against her, right? And all sorts of violent threats and whatnot. She was moved out of the state. I don't know if she's back or not at this point, but is no longer, or at least last I checked, is no longer working there. And then there are also students and professors who came out to stand in support with Olga. Right? That she should have the right to say, express certain kinds of things in a college classroom, and that it might make people feel uncomfortable, but isn't that part of education, feeling just a little bit uncomfortable? And I don't just mean these seats. So we have, like I was saying before, like it really has to do a lot with the First Amendment, right? And whether or not you have the right to expression. And so it's a really hard thing when we start thinking about like what the university has to do. Like what kind of space, what kind of place does a university need to be? Because in order for education to happen, for you to learn something, right? So this would be sort of the educational aspect of expression as opposed to your political aspect of expression. Is that we have to create these spaces where people can feel like they are safe in these spaces so that they can learn. Because when you feel all the time like this isn't a safe place for me, then maybe that's not the kind of place where you can learn, right? And so sometimes we mean literally, like things get canceled on campus because you have to feel like you're safe in the college classroom so that learning can happen. Right? So if you remember Dewey, right? Being safe is kind of at the bottom of that pyramid. You have to have that before you can move up the ladder. But at the same time, you also have to have this ideational exposure. It's a big word for saying sometimes you have to be confronted with ideas you may not be aware of or may not like. So how do you kind of balance between those two things, right? So what's the happy medium, and how do we go about finding that? Because really, like what happens in response to a lot of these events on campuses is that you have people who go on the internet and they create memes and they have all of these different sorts of responses, right? So you have hate speech is not free speech. Every time hate speech is permitted, it costs someone part of his or herself, part of their self-respect or part of their sanity. It rips people to shred and destroys society, right? So what's the balance between safety for people and other people's right to express themselves? You also have people who are want to create and protect safe kinds of spaces on campus, right? But then you also have safe space, right? No ideas that we don't like. Or warning, I support free speech, not political correctness. So you have all of these responses to it, right? Does anybody seem, we talk about rhetoric in here, right, and active persuasion, does it seem like people are persuading others with their ideas? Maybe less so. Question in the back.
Yeah, I had a question along this lines, but a little bit separate from the rhetoric question. I was reading an article, I think it was in Time recently, about the way that Germany restricted free speech on swastikas, how they basically completely banned it. You're not allowed to have swastikas anywhere in Germany except for historical museums, and that's actually been really successful for them to kind of get over the past and create a much more peaceful environment. Do you think we're ever going to like kind of reach that point where it's like this is restricted but people are okay with it here?
I'm going to go with no. And part of the reason is because in this country, there are two justifications, or there's probably more, but two kind of primary justifications for why you should have the right to expression. One of them has to do with is socially produced, right? That we have the right to expression because we need to have ideas tested out in the world so we can figure out together what the best opportunity is. This should be like, oh my gosh, Protagoras, oh my gosh, Aristotle, right? That should be ringing in your heads right now, and if it's not, that should be ringing in your heads. So the idea that we need to have expression so that we can test ideas, right? That's that ideational exposure. We have to have the ideas out there so we can test them and think about them, right? But on the other hand, there's also this justification for the First Amendment that really that is not about like the community, but is more about I have the right to say something because I'm a person and I get that right. So maybe you see that more often on like Facebook and Twitter and things along those lines. Like I'm going to say it, and I'm going to say it because I want to say it, and it's my right to say it. Oftentimes they don't think that there should be like a backlash to that, right? Which is not really a part of the First Amendment. If you didn't get arrested for it and put in jail, then you got your right to free speech. Hold on.
That's where we get to
Yeah.
the other.
Yeah. I know. Oh. I'll be quick right after this. Yeah.
In terms of freedom of expression, I think it's something maybe the First Amendment doesn't highlight, but when we're talking about freedom of expression, is it always in like a public setting, like people you don't know in your class, or could it be in like certain like cultural groups or clubs that the freedom of expression?
Yeah, it also applies to those. There's lots of cases on like whether, and it has more to do, most often in the courts, it has more to do with religion, right? So what clubs can and can't be on campus, and what you can and can't say in terms of that. So one of the, yeah.
I am actually from Germany,
Mhm.
and I think because of the past that happened there, even now for soccer games, people, it's very, like when they take out their flags, there's a lot of people saying, you shouldn't do that, that's not okay. And because they're not proud of it, I think here it would take a long time because people are really proud. Every time I see those flags, I'm like, oh my God, in my country, this is not okay.
Yeah, I'm not okay with this. So sort of a cultural shaming that comes along with maybe some of the other stuff. But we don't really have the laws for that here, and it has to be so what I would like to say, right, so like that we move along, is a lot of what ends up happening is sort of this, is this culture or this politics of resentment. That what we end up doing is, and this is along the lines of like what kind of happens on Facebook, so I don't, or on Twitter, right? Like I don't know the last time what it was that you shared something personal about yourself, but I stopped doing that, and why I'm not on Facebook now also. But I stopped doing that because anytime you put something out there and you risk the possibility that you're just going to be smacked down for the sake of getting smacked down, right? Like that's a function of trolls. So what it does is it just creates sort of this resentment, right? And we don't work through things together. We don't really test those ideas. It's about my right to put what I want out into the world. And so what I would like to say, and this might sound strange coming from a communication professor, what I would like to say is that I don't think that some of the answers to this lies in more communication, right? So the ACLU will say that the response to hate speech should be more speech. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think we have a lot of speech out in the world right now. I don't know that it's undoing any of this politics of resentment, right? I don't know that it's necessarily making our democracy any healthier. What I would like to say is that it probably comes down to what we need to think about in terms of credibility, right? So we talked about credibility in terms of sagacity, goodwill, and character. And if we were going to take seriously why people need safe spaces because of the traumas they've experienced in their own lives and what that means to their educational experience here. If we are going to take seriously that somebody doesn't feel like their political perspective is being given its due representation on a college campus, if we're not going to take seriously those things and think about the goodwill that it would require on campuses, from professors, from our administrations, and from others, then I don't know that we can really meet all of our goals, but that we would think more so about how we can communicate, not necessarily just our ideas, but that we would have that goodwill in mind. That I would think that I could sit down with somebody and actually engage in the ideas as opposed to being confronted with those ideas. So it's not just about more communication, it's about the means by which, or not just the means by which, it's about sort of the ethics that I take in that communication situation. So like when we were talking about Plato and we were talking about noble rhetoric, right? That we might think that the noble rhetorician and the Phaedrus is somebody who is the lover, the person who cares about me, right? Who takes my best interest in mind when they're having that discussion. That's more so the model that we should be thinking about. So not more communication, more goodwill. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to our other speakers.
Questions within are very, very good. It's probably limiting the questions that we can ask at the end to be able to fit within the program, but we'll make sure that we get 8 minutes or so from our following 2 speakers. Our next speaker is Barbara Kingsley Wilson. She earned her BA in journalism from Ohio University and her MA from Ohio State University. I think they prefer the Ohio State University these days. She has been a journalist for 20 years, writing for notable news outlets, including USA Today, the Orange County Register, and the Cleveland Plain Dealer. She has won awards from the Associated Press, Orange County Press Club, and contributed stories to the Register's Pulitzer Prize-winning coverage of a fertility scandal. She has also covered international stories, including time spent in Jordan and Israel. She served as president of the California College Media Association, and in 2016 was named Educator of the Year by the California Journalism and Media Affiliates. She is currently advisor to the award-winning Daily 49ers student newspaper here at Long Beach State, and continues writing for news organizations, including the Southern California News Group. Her work for the center includes thinking about issues pertaining to freedom of the press in domestic and international contexts, and today she'll be speaking about issues and controversies of student expression and freedom of the press. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
As I just was saying, I advise the Daily 49er newspaper. And just this week in the newsroom, one of the editors was telling the editor of the whole paper, Miranda Andrade Ceja, that the president of the university was writing a letter to the paper about a story that we ran that was complaining about something that she did, that she wasn't supporting enough the sanctuary city or the sanctuary campus movement. Anyway, as the editor was saying that to the editor of the whole paper, Miranda, I saw a shadow of fear sort of cross her face as she was being told that maybe the president's mad at us, which wasn't really what was said, but that was the undercurrent. She wrote a letter. She wanted to address this story. But I just saw this shadow, cross, Miranda's face, and Miranda's kind of a badass, She was in La Raza, SQE, march into Brotman Hall, protesting tuition increases, protesting treatment of undocumented students, all sorts of things. But that reminded me of something that I've been thinking about, and I'm supposed to think, according to this. My colleagues and I in journalism, we train journalists to exercise their First Amendment rights, and some of that is skill building. Truth to power expectations for journalists are well known. We know and we practice that training, experience, practice helps them draw the most of their First Amendment mettle. But there's something else to that too. There are also subtle forces at work, and I see them in the newsroom all the time, and that is the forces of self-censorship, where students are afraid to ask that question because they won't get an answer, because they're speaking to someone in a suit, and they don't think they'll get the answer they want. They don't think they'll tell them anything. The person seems mean. They're dismissive of them, and so they kind of censor, they kind of stop their questions. Edit, censor, it sometimes becomes a fine line. There was a study recently, very recently, by two University of Kansas professors that studied boys and girls in high school journalism. And it said that girls are far more likely to be censored and to self-censor than are boys. Our journalism classes are full of women, these people who went on from high school to college. So it's something we have to kind of keep an eye on. They didn't. I talked to one of the researchers. She didn't really know the reason why. It was Janelle Belmas from our university who went on to Kansas. But they did say that some of the questions that the girls asked were a little tougher. They were about, drugs maybe, or some issues that high schools didn't want to talk about. Now, I just want to back up a second and say that at our university, in the state of California, there are good protections for journalists and advisors like me. You can't fire me because of something that runs in the paper. You can't suppress student speech in this state. There are really good protections. And the 49er, at least in my 13 years there, has never run into that I know of, someone trying to stop their speech, a professor saying, don't run that, or some editor being dismissed. That has happened at other campuses. It really has. Some smaller ones in particular. But I guess what I want to say is that we as educators have to train the basics, and they are really important. Writing, producing, fact-checking, research. Did I mention fact-checking? Fact-checking, very big. But also the reporting that helps them ask tough questions and not censor themselves. Questions to administrators, questions to people who are their parents' age or older, and that people who make the laws, people that are in charge, people that kind of govern their futures too, sometimes professors, sometimes people like me. We have to do these things and help them be aware of that fear, that something in their growing up that makes them afraid to ask. So they can more confidently walk that line between fear and confidence. I used to have an editor who had a thing on his computer, fear and arrogance. And it was, every reporter has that. You have the fear that you got something wrong, and you have the fear that you'll screw something up. But the arrogance saying, I know this issue, I've done the research, I can talk to these people, they know me, I know them, they know I don't mess around, you have to walk that balance all the time and keep those forces in check. Now Miranda, I talked to her after, they're running the letter from the president. She has questioned the president repeatedly about other issues on campus, including a censorship issue that came up when a play with a very provocative name was canceled for, well, reasons that have a bit of disagreement on this campus. And she will continue to do that. And I asked her about that, what I saw in her behavior and stuff like that. She goes, that, you know, it's a mix of things, authority being mad, yes, but also that reporter's fear of, did I get it right? Did we screw up? You know, that kind of thing, that I'm in my 50s, I still report, I still get that, it doesn't stop, but you get to be aware of it and you weigh it more and more as you get more experience. So, you know, she says, you know, I put on my reporter's face. These kind of feelings won't stop me from publicizing something that criticizes the administration or professors or people I even get grades from. But we need, as educators, to not only infuse the basics, but infuse that day-to-day, line-by-line confidence that, yes, you can ask those questions. There's no reason they shouldn't answer them. Yes, you can get those records. And you need to take that in, starting at this sort of palette that we're working on the college campus, and expand that to when they become national, international reporters, and fully expand that First Amendment medal. And there's no time like the present, because it's important. But that's all I want to say, and I'm ready for the next person.
The next speaker is Professor Christopher Karajov. He has served as a journalist in his native Bulgaria at the time when the Berlin Wall fell. He completed his master's in journalism and mass communication in Sofia University in Bulgaria. He worked full-time at Bulgaria's largest daily media outlet, becoming a senior government reporter. He has been the recipient of a Washington-based fellowship as an international journalist and worked as a reporter for the Dallas Morning News. After his full career as a journalist, he earned a doctorate in mass communications at the University of Florida. While a doctoral student, he continued as a part-time contributor to Bulgarian media, while also working for international outlets such as BBC's World Service and Prague-based magazine Transitions Online. In 2001, he was appointed as an assistant professor of journalism at the State University of New York at Oswego, and he joined the journalism department because he has good judgment at California State University, Long Beach in August 2005. He teaches global news media, reporting and information gathering, investigative reporting, mass communication research methods, mass communication theory, and continues his involvement with studying Eastern European media through lectures, grants, conference papers, and publications. Please welcome Professor Karajov.
Thank you, Professor Johnson. I think it was mostly because of the weather, actually, because the choice between Syracuse and Long Beach is a very straightforward one. But as the time went by, I have started to spend a lot more time indoors and online, coincidentally, because of the rise of social media. And just recently, around the time of the Charlottesville controversy and all that was going on this summer, I had a very interesting exchange on the timeline of a friend of mine on Facebook, where I read some friend of this friend writing about, well, hate speech and all these types of offensive speech should be banned by the government from Facebook, from occurring on Facebook. And Professor Senas mentioned that in countries like Germany, we have laws that prohibit the use of swastika. In fact, 10 or 11 European Union countries would put you in jail for just denying the Holocaust. So the reality there is a lot more different than in the United States. We do not have largely criminal prosecution for free speech. And the idea that some type of speech might be banned by the government on a social media platform was also kind of interesting. So I engaged in a conversation, as I sometimes do, because I believe, I don't know what I believe, but I cannot restrain myself from educating people and getting into all these kinds of discussions. And we started, talking back and forth, and I wrote to this guy, well, listen, this unlike Europe, unlike many other countries in the world, talking about democracies, because of course in North Korea it's all PG and you have total free speech. But talking about democracies, of the Western democracies, in the United States, there are some criteria that are set not by the First Amendment itself, but by the interpretation of the First Amendment, what Professor Johnson talked about, by the practice of the Supreme Court, and with respect to certain inciting types of speech, we have something called the Brandenburg test, where end of 1960s, where this KKK leader, Clarence Brandenburg, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the court came down with a two-pronged test that basically posits that, hey, for the speech to be prohibited, it first of all has to be very specific. So just saying something along the lines of what this neo-Nazis were chanting in Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us, is not specific enough. It has to be, kill or something like that. And yes, it has to be, according to the court. And it has to be credible. If we get into an argument and I yell at you, I'm gonna kill you, that's not very credible, because you run away. But if the same people around, I have a dog too, but if the same people in Charlottesville were there's a synagogue and they're pointing and well, let's go and burn the synagogue, then it becomes a credible threat, and under the Brandenburg test, it becomes something that can be prohibited, and so on. So I explained all this very reasonably as I thought, but the guy keeps on, pushing. Said no, not only hate speech, not only offensive speech in posts or comments or whatever, but also fake news should be banned by the government. I'm like, wow, that's really interesting. So how do you define fake news? And I engaged with him for maybe another 3-4 posts. And then I realized that he's really off. What was really interesting development in this was that then a friend of mine on whose timeline, on his wall, this was happening, wrote to me a private message. She said, "By the way, such and such is a journalist, and he's a pretty good journalist." I said, "Really? A journalist who advocates for less speech? That is really a novelty, right, Mark?" Most journalists are pushing for more speech, not less. But I looked him up, and he was a local journalist. So I started thinking about this, and it just shows how the degree of exasperation that exists, and the degree of frustration that we all feel, about not just offensive speech, but also about fake news, about anything that is really off, but proliferates on social media regardless. This said, it is extremely difficult and unlikely that there can be or will be any government action limiting or prohibiting access to social media or speech on social media. There's a very interesting case that was just decided this summer by the Supreme Court, called Packingham v. North Carolina. It is about a guy who is probably the least likely advocate for free speech, Lester Gerard Packingham, who was a convicted felon, sexual offender, who had sex when he was in his early 20s with a 13-year-old girl. He gets convicted, goes to jail for 1 year or so, gets released, and then, lo and behold, several years later, he gets a parking ticket waived. So he goes on Facebook and writes about his waived parking ticket, something to the tune of, what did he write? Praise be God, wow, capital W-O-W. That's his post about his parking ticket. Nothing about sex with minors. So he just happy he doesn't have to pay his whatever $47 parking ticket. Well, somebody reports him for that, and there is a law in North Carolina that if you have been convicted as a sexual offender, you cannot have contact online with minors, but moreover, you cannot be on social media where minors are supposedly active. So that's the law in North Carolina. He gets convicted in trial court, then the next level appeals court reverses that, and then the North Carolina Supreme Court reinstates the conviction, saying that this is basically they're regulating conduct, not speech. So he was online to whatever, prey on minors who really would appreciate him not having to pay a parking ticket, or I don't know. But it says that the decision of the North Carolina Supreme Court was that he is basically preying online on this man. So this goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and last summer, summer of 2017, the Supreme Court comes with a unanimous decision in favor of this, convicted sexual offender, Packingham. This is one of the first truly important decisions that regulate the relationship between the First Amendment and the modern Internet. The fact that it was decided unanimously, Justice Gorsuch did not take part in the decision, so it was basically 8-0, is a fairly strong attestation of how the Supreme Court feels about the issue. The rationale of the Supreme Court, there were opinions written by Justice Kennedy and Justice Alito, I think. So was that the North Carolina law was just way too broad, that it restricted access to way too much of the media space. That yes, the government, the state, has the right and the interest to prohibit contact between sex offenders and their potential victims, especially minors, of course. But the way that the law has been written is just way too broad. And what if this person reposts Rihanna video on his YouTube channel? Is he even allowed to have a YouTube channel under this law? Probably not, because he's not allowed to gloat about his parking ticket. So that was one of the first really important decisions, which prohibits essentially the government from prohibiting you and me and all to be restricted in our access to social media, which does not mean that Facebook or Twitter or any of those social media platforms cannot prohibit any of us under whatever rules except under the most broad anti-discrimination rules. So you cannot be prohibited from being on Facebook, you know, for your religion or gender or you know, a number of other categories, but you can be prohibited if you exhibit certain types of behavior that Facebook thinks are not appropriate to that platform. Ditto for Twitter, ditto for Instagram, ditto for all these social media. So yeah, that's kind of the legal landscape nowadays. It's developing, very active, very interesting, very challenging if you are either somebody involved in the media or somebody involved in the legal profession for that matter. It's by all means extremely interesting to watch and discuss and see what happens.
I'm going to quickly conclude by thanking you for your questions within. Of course, we ran out of time for the questions at the end. I'm willing to hang around afterwards if you'd like to ask some questions or talk some more. Thank you so much for coming to this year's Constitution Day event, and I hope that you come next year.